Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's presentation. Today's Kitchen Botany, or the Joy of Mutations. Today's presentation, as you can tell from the title, is a bit of a departure from our normal subject matter, where we tend to focus on native plants and animals and ecosystems and conservation and all these wonderful things. But if you stick around with us till the end, you'll find out how all this fits in. But today, let's just spend some time learning a bit about plants in the kitchen, which you probably already know. I'm James Stevenson. You might want to jot down my email address here on the screen if you have any questions that you think of after today's presentation. In the meantime, do feel free to use the Q&A feature on your control panel here on the Zoom webinar platform. Put your questions in the Q&A, and Julia and I will make sure to get to those questions that we can before the end of today's presentation. So the title is Kitchen Botany. And we put the word botany in the title because we want to remind everyone that this is, after all, science. And botany, of course, is the study of plants. So let's study some plants today, like this, the fruit of the corn plant. And then look at some mutations, the joy of mutations, and finally follow those mutations to the point where we've developed, as people, as humans, we've developed through mutation plants to eat, plants that would never survive in the wild as they are on their own. So let's start with a little science. Let's use the biggest words that we're going to use today right now and get all the scary botany stuff out of the way. Plants are multicellular organisms, okay? Just like animals are multicellular organisms, so are plants. And just like animals, plants have organs that are groups of tissues composed of cells, and each organ has a particular job to do. So again, if you extrapolate that into what you know about animals, humans, we're multicellular organisms. We have organs. We have different organs that have different functions. Of course, they're not independent of one another, but our brain has a particular function. Our heart has a particular function. And plants have organs made up of the tissues of the cells of their bodies. And all the organs that we have, plants just have three main organs. And I bet you've heard of them before. The roots, the stems, and the leaves. See how easy botany is? Multicellular organisms, plants with the three main organs. And today's presentation is going to focus on those three components and what we humans have done to these organs and co-opted their natural uses or their natural roles in the success of these plants, what we've done to them for our own benefit. So for the plant, the organ that's called the root system is what the plants used mostly to hold themselves in place. Plants are stuck where they are, and they're rooted into the ground, and that's where they're going to spend their entire lives. Also, roots are where water and nutrients can be absorbed, right? So we have roots anchoring, roots absorbing the water and the nutrition. But for people, what's most important is the facility of roots to store nutrients. And it's that storage capacity of certain plants that humans have co-opted and exaggerated and turned into food. We'll start with a very common root, the humble radish. Radishes, it's like you either love them or you hate them. A wild radish has all the component parts of any plant, roots, stems, leaves, and at some point, that plant has to reproduce itself. And radish, like many other plants, live for just 2 years. Radishes will spend 1 year, one growing season. After germinating, they'll spend 1 year storing starch, sugar, photosynthate in these swollen roots. And then the following year, they'll use that stored up energy to burst forth and flower and reproduce. Humans stop that process. We stop the radish when it's finished storing up all this wonderful starch, and we take it and we eat it and we move on. Radish is gone, radish never reproduces. We have taken advantage of all of this wonderful starch. What you see here is the storage area of the root. And what you see here, this little green crescent shape with a few miniature little leaves, that's the stem that's going to elongate in the second year and bolt up and grow and flower to produce the seeds to produce next year's radish. So that life cycle is referred to as a biennial life cycle. And radishes left on their own in the wild would go through this life cycle, flowering every other year, and the parent plant dying after setting seed. Humans halt that process and eat up all that wonderful starch that's been stored away. Raphanus is the genus name for radish. That's just an old and ancient Latin early people's name for this wild plant that can be found throughout Europe. Sativus means it's been brought into cultivation. So we're not quite sure what species of Raphanus was brought into cultivation, and we'll talk about that later. But through mutation and selection, we humans have selected those plants that can produce the biggest, juiciest, starchiest storage root. And therefore, mutations that have appeared along the way have been taken advantage of by people. Same can be said for the parsnip, Pastinaca. If you're familiar with parsnips, they have a sweet flavor. They're kind of like a sweet carrot, even sweeter than carrots. And that's because they're related to carrots. This storage root, again, same life cycle, unrelated, completely unrelated to radishes, but the same life cycle of spending one growing season storing up starch and the second season bursting into flower to reproduce that plant. Parsnips are related to carrots. They're also related to parsley. They have the characteristic flat-topped inflorescences, and they've been cultivated for thousands of years. From a wild plant with a kind of very small, hardly exaggerated taproot that it uses to produce flowers in the second year, humans have in cultivation taken advantage of mutations that would be a detriment to the plant in the wild, but under cultivation, under the protection of people, these plants can be grown on a even semi-commercial scale. Another root, since we're looking at the root systems, is the beetroot, another storage root. And beetroot is also not related to carrots, not related to radishes, in its own complete family, but with the same life cycle of storing up energy one year and using that energy the following year to carry out its reproductive cycle. The roots are, of course, harvested, cleaned, and prepared however you like. The wild beet can still be found in nature, living out its biennial life cycle. It's referred to as the sea beet, Beta vulgaris maritima. Maritima means of the sea, and you can maybe infer from the name that this wild plant is found in coastal areas. But humans throughout history noticed this plant, took this plant, brought it into cultivation, and took advantage of the mutations that are a natural part of plant seedlings. Certain seedlings are going to come up weirder than others. Humans are going to notice these things, take advantage of these things, exaggerate these mutations until we can come up with forms or mutations or cultivars or selections, however you want to say it, to suit our own needs. And this species, the sea beet, in cultivation, has been developed into at least these three groups of varieties, subspecies, selections, cultivars, mutations, however you want to say it. Selecting for edible leaves in this plant, this sea beet, selecting for nice tender edible leaves has given us a plant known as chard. Selecting for exaggerated storage roots has produced from the wild a cultivated plant called beetroot. Another mutation that has been selected for and encouraged and exaggerated over time is the sugar beet. So these are all the same species, but in cultivation and through various selections made unnaturally by people, these three groups of vegetables have been derived. And these plants are not related to radish, they're not related to parsnip, they're in the amaranth family, which puts them more closely related to spinach. These are mutations. This is the joy of mutation, sometimes referred to as selections. So humans have these plants in cultivation. They notice a weird one that has a trait that's desirable. That one is selected and coddled and grown, and the seeds are collected from that plant that has the desirable trait. And then those seeds, perhaps a seedling from there is going to have an exaggerated trait, and so on. It's no different than breeding dogs and taking this one species and turning it into all these different mutations and taking advantage of the certain characteristics of one and calling it something else. In the industry, these are referred to as cultivars because these mutations have been maintained and exaggerated in cultivation. Most of the vegetables we grow today wouldn't have a chance in the wild, couldn't live through a single life cycle in the wild. They have lost natural defense mechanisms, they've lost defensive chemicals, all of their defenses have been bred out or selected out, and so they could not survive at all in the wild. In the wild, the carrot, you'll remember our parsnip, this is a relative to carrot, probably the best known of the root vegetables. In the wild, the carrot might be familiar to some as a wildflower. Carrot, grocery store carrot, is the same species as a wildflower known as Queen Anne's lace. And Queen Anne's lace is not naturalized this far south, but Queen Anne's lace has naturalized in much of the East Coast. And most old pastures or fields or roadsides are populated with this non-native plant that's established in North America, Queen Anne's lace, or Daucus carota. Digging up the wild type of carrot presents us with this shocker. Doesn't that look delicious? That is what carrots were derived from. That is the level of mutation, selection, cultivation, exaggeration that humans are capable of, turning this, which was probably eaten to survive, into the carrots that we know today. And through just folly, humans have taken the plasticity of the pigments present in the carrot genome and exaggerated them into these basically fanciful color forms. So the carrot has plastic genes to allow for different color forms within the root. Humans have played with that and developed these different cultivars from the wild Queen Anne's lace. That's how plant selection and breeding works. The wild carrot, Daucus carota, evolved naturally in the Near East, around this area south of the Caspian Sea, which has had many, many names over the millennia of human habitation. Today, the Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Iraq, that sort of area, this is where Queen Anne's lace, this is where Daucus carota is native. And it's here where the early peoples took this that they were just subsisting on, and turned it into the carrots that we know today. But in the East, the purple color was preferred for whatever reason. And carrots in the East are purple. It's just what's preferred. It's just what they expect to find at the market. If they're going to get some carrots for whatever they're making, they're going to expect what comes home to be purple. In the West, when carrots moved west, I can't explain why, but in the hands of the people of the Netherlands, the color orange was selected for and preferred. So now in the West, when we go to our markets to get carrots, what we're expecting to find is the orange carrot. Now, wild carrots are not orange, but the pigment is in existence in the genome, and they were selected by the people in the Netherlands because it's their national color. No other reason. It's the royal color, the House of Orange. The Dutch gave us orange carrots, and that's what we expect today. Moving on to stems, we've covered some roots. Certainly there's tons more roots that we could talk about, but generally the ideas are the same. Storage, exaggerated by people, selections were made for size and color and sugar content across several different plant families, from taking something in the wild, removing all its defensive chemistry, exaggerating body parts that couldn't survive in the wild, and bringing them in cultivation, coddling them there, and even developing color forms just for fun. Same things have been done for all the different organs in the plant. So let's move up from the ground and into the stems. For a plant, a stem is really, its basic function is to present the solar panels to the sun. Because without the sun, we don't get photosynthesis. And without photosynthesis, we don't get starch, sugar. That's what plants live on. And up the food chain, everything depends on plants turning air and sunlight and water into complex carbohydrates known as starches and sugars. Those solar panels where all this magic happens, known as the leaves in most cases, they're supported by the stem. On the stem is also where important things like the flowers in flowering plant, where the reproductive organs are going to be expressed from the stem, where leaves, as we mentioned before, and branching, the abilities of plants to grow exponentially, creating and presenting that many more photosynthetic surfaces. But people can't help ourselves. There's got to be something good to eat in the stem of plants. And there is a wild plant whose scientific name is Asparagus officinalis. It's not that hard, folks. We can all speak Latin. If you've ever said the word asparagus, you're using a Latin name for a plant. Asparagus officinalis is a temperate species. That means it grows in an area with cold winters and warm summers. In the early spring, after a winter dormancy, the new stems push through the ground, and what first pops up, those emerging stems, are what we call asparagus spears. So here are asparagus stems poking through the cold ground, first thing in the season. Eventually, these will elongate and grow into the stems that will be supporting and presenting the photosynthetic surfaces that are going to feed the plant throughout its life cycle. The branches are going to present flowers to pollinators. The flowers are going to be pollinated and turn into fruit to reproduce the plant. But asparagus grows year after year after year. This is one of few vegetables that aren't completely harvested 100% at the end of their growing season. Only the growing stem tips are harvested in asparagus, which has made it kind of a timely crop historically. Asparagus would only become available at the beginning of the growing season. For about 6 weeks, when asparagus throughout its range of comfort zones would begin to grow. And then the rest of the year, asparagus is not available, which has made it, an expensive vegetable in the past. With today's global economy, it's always spring somewhere, and asparagus is growing and emerging from the ground as stems somewhere year-round, and that has made asparagus available year-round. But eventually, those stems will elongate. If you're unlucky enough to have a plant called asparagus fern in your yard or in some sphere of influence that you have, it's the same genus. And if you have the unfortunate opportunity to have tried to remove that plant, you'll know that it's covered in spines. Its defense mechanisms are very much in place. And the stems of the edible asparagus, once they've elongated, become extremely fibrous, indigestible, perfectly capable of presenting their also indigestible leaves to the sun so that it can go through its life cycle, having survived being cut to the ground by the hungry people. Asparagus is in its own family. It even lends its name to the entire family, the Asparagaceae, and it includes plants like agave and yucca and hosta. And if you smilax, if you kind of expand your mind a little bit, if you've ever seen one of those century plants that grow quite a lot here in Pinellas County, every 100 years, they send out that huge flowering spike. Doesn't it look like a giant spear of asparagus? You can see the familial resemblance there. It is a giant spear of asparagus. I wouldn't dare eat it. Moving on, our next stem. Some might think of potatoes as roots because they're found underground. But technically, and now that you're all botanists, you will understand that potatoes are actually stem tissue. Do you remember some of the structures that are formed only by the stems, the buds, the flowers, the branches? All of these things come up out of a potato. And don't lie, this has happened to all of you in your salad crisper, the forgotten potato. The stem left in the salad crisper has decided to go ahead and start without you. And the little buds, which we refer to as eyes, are growing the side branches and producing the new leaves, stems, and roots, those activities that can only be carried out by stem tissue. So solanum, tuberosum, that means the tuberous-bearing solanum, stem tissue. In this case, the stem has been modified to store the carbohydrates that the plant is going to use to spend an unfavorable season safe and underground. Be it a cold winter or a dry season, the potato has evolved this overwintering or over-seasoning organ, the storage organ, to store up the energy that it's going to need to begin growth the following favorable season. The flowers of the potato might look familiar. The leaves of the potato might look familiar. The solanum has the same root as sleep or slumber. It belongs to the Solanaceae family of plants, the deadly nightshade family. So the defense mechanisms there are deadly toxins, which in many members of the Solanaceae are there for their own protection. This is actually a photograph of deadly nightshade. Wonder how it gets its name. The stem tissue stored underground of this species of solanum do not contain those toxins. And what toxins they ever did contain have been selected against. And so those plants with the least amount of toxin, which may or may not have been sequestered into those storage stems underground, have long been bred out of the plant. We'll stick with stems for just a minute, and we're going to spend a little bit of time with this poor thing. This European wildflower is actually endangered in the wild. This is a plant that grows naturally, has historically grown naturally throughout Europe, but can now only be found in a few isolated populations kind of here and there. It's been overexploited, overcollected, and now can only be found in a few places. It's called wild cabbage, and I want you to learn this name, Brassica oleracea. You might have heard of the brassicas, maybe. Oleracea means it's a crop. So here's a wild flower that has been brought into cultivation and has been manipulated and poked and prodded so many times into so many different forms. Those forms could never survive in the wild. But we're talking about stems. There's no stem here. It's just a ring of leaves on the ground. Let's look at this longitudinally. And we have a taproot, and we have that rosette of leaves right at the soil surface. The stem has been squished down into just a little kind of cone shape right here at ground level. Eventually, that little squished up stem is going to elongate. When environmental conditions are just right, that stem is going to elongate. That Brassica oleracea is going to wait until conditions are just right, and it's going to initiate flowering. What are people going to do? We're going to stop that process. We're going to prevent this plant from going from a nice flat rosette into a great big tall, 2.5 meter tall, flowering wild cabbage. People aren't going to let that happen. We're going to stop it. And we're going to select for those plants that are so mutated that they almost can't reproduce anymore. And we're going to come up, people have come up with things like cauliflower. You're not going to wander into the woods ever and come across a wild cauliflower. It is an anathema, but it is something that has been selected and bred for. Brassica oleracea, and the variety is botrytis, which means clustered like grapes. And when you see what the stem is trying to be, the stem is trying to elongate, but through mutations that have been taken advantage of, we have this horrible clustered, swollen thing that lots of people find really yummy. And I'm not one of those people, but it stood the test of time. Cauliflower is a thing, and cauliflower is the undeveloped, underdeveloped, never going to develop, crumpled up stem of Brassica oleracea. Kohlrabi is another mutation of Brassica oleracea. And the selection here is just for the main stalk becoming this engorged storage area. And this stem, again, this is all subjective. I do think this one's quite yummy. This one, with its thick skin, if you remove that, you get to the nice tender flesh, if you will, that carbohydrate stored up starch inside the stem. Brassicaceae, oleracea, same thing, it's wild cabbage, but this one is a mutation where a swollen stem has been selected for. Sticking with our poor old Brassica oleracea, here we have a selection for the flowering stalk, only it's been allowed to push forth a little bit beyond the cauliflower stage. The stem has elongated a bit more naturally, and this plant has actually gone into the initiation of the flower buds. And what we eat on the top of the little trees are the developing flower buds. So you can see what this plant is trying to do, just like its wild ancestor. It's trying to get big and tall, open up these hundreds of flowers, present them to the pollinators, develop the seeds, and grow the next generation. But we've stopped this process and harvested the developing flowering, the developing inflorescences. Most vegetable gardeners, again, if you're a vegetable gardener, don't lie, have had the situation where the broccoli gets that much further ahead of us and goes ahead and the flowers open, and we miss our opportunity. But the Brassica oleracea is going to continue with its mission to open flowers, to present to pollinators, to produce seed, to make hopefully a better life for its offspring. And when those flowers open, characteristic of not only the genus Brassica, but of the entire family that includes radish, the Brassicaceae, they're also known as the cruciferous vegetables because their flowers form a cross. They're cruciferous, they're cross-bearing. So you might have heard of the cruciferous vegetables, radish, cabbage, and all of these derivations of poor old Brassica oleracea. So let's do a quick review. We looked at the organs of a plant. We looked at roots and stems. These are not unfamiliar words, but they are botanical words. We learned a few plant families. We learned the Brassicaceae, the cruciferous vegetables. We saw the, who else have we seen? The the carrot family, the Apiaceae, and the asparagus family, the Asparagaceae, all these scientific names that are now not unfamiliar to you. We talked about plants that spend 2 years to fulfill their life cycle and how people stop them after their first go at storing up energy for the second year. Mutations leading to different varieties or also selections or named cultivars through the breeding, the selective and intentional breeding of these plants in cultivation, stripping them of their natural defensives and making them unable to survive as they would be in the wild. We saw the beetroots and the Amaranthaceae, the carrots and the Apiaceae, asparagus, all of these stems and roots that we've looked at, the flowers of the Cruciferous, the Brassicaceae family, and the deadly Solanaceae, the deadly nightshade family. So we'll meet these again when we move up the plant a little bit further and into the leaves. And we mentioned before, the leaves are the solar panels. They are the solar collection organs. They are ultimately, in most plants, the majority of plants, they are the location of photosynthesis, primary photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is that magic that plants do, turning sunlight and air and water into sugar. Magic. And it's the basis of most food webs on Earth. So let's look at leaves. And when you talk about eating plants, if you were imagining eating a plant, you would probably imagine eating the leaves. I mean, leaves make up most of the plant. And if you think about the edible parts, you're probably going to think of the leaves first, right? You might not have considered that, oh, we eat stems, do we? And when you think then about eating the leaves, you're probably going to turn to your mixed salad. And of course, salad is a collection of different types, shapes, sizes, and colors of leaves. But where did these come from? These were not collected out in the woods. These salad greens and other leaves that we'll be looking at, these are the result of hundreds of years and hundreds of thousands of generations of crossbreeding, hybridization, inbreeding, outbreeding, backbreeding, breeding all over the place to arrive at those forms that suit our needs and sometimes just our fancy. Cabbage is a leaf crop. Look who it is. It's our favorite, Brassica oleracea. Look what we've done to this poor thing. Imagine a wild cabbage whose leaves grow over themselves over and over and over to the point where it's created this almost impenetrable sphere of compacted leaves. That's not a recipe for survival in the wild. It just isn't. This is a plant that obviously could not survive on its own in the wild. This is a mutation, a selection under cultivation has resulted in this Brassica oleracea, the variety capitata, which means it's turned itself into a head. You just might be able to make in the background this little cone-shaped, that's the stem trying to bust free. Another selection of Brassica oleracea leaves has given us probably closest to the wild plant, Brassica oleracea, the variety viridis, which are the greens, the collard greens and the kale, all these things. I quite am fond of the collard greens. Again, pretty much seasonal still. Kale is just Brassica oleracea with crinkly leaves. So There's nothing magic about kale. It's Brassica oleracea. It just happens to have these fancy leaves that have been selected for their curly qualities. At this point, because we've been doing this presentation for several years, the question almost invariably comes up. There are hundreds of varieties of vegetables that have been selected for hundreds of years, for hundreds of different tastes, if you will. There are breeding programs that have an end in mind, creating the newest, the most colorful, the largest leaf, the tenderest, all these things, all these economic drivers for creating new named cultivars. So there, I'm just showing you the tippest of the iceberg. I have consulted with the nutritionists. Nutrition is not something that I have ever focused on. I'm more of a botanist. I look at what we've got in front of us. Nutrition requires a much, much deeper thought and experiment and test and all these things. I have never been given any reason to believe that there is a nutritional difference between a purple carrot and a yellow carrot, or a white carrot and an orange carrot. Certainly, it could be argued that there is more nutritional value to a cultivated purple, green, yellow, orange, white, anything carrot than that wild little fibrous string that it was derived from. But generally speaking, just eat your vegetables. It doesn't matter what they look like. Sometimes they're just made to be pretty for fun, like this rainbow kale. Moving on, we're just about to leave Brassica oleracea alone, but let's just look at another cultivar. This one is known as Brussels sprouts. These are leaves that form along the stem at the bud areas where branches or flowering branches are supposed to be forming. A mutation along the stem, look, started out as a normal looking plant, a normal looking wild cabbage. This is what wild cabbage looks like when it's a little seedling. But then this happens, and the side branches are folded in on themselves and bunched up and curled up and absolutely unnaturally kind of contorted into the Brussels sprouts that are then harvested from along the stem itself. So again, bunches of leaves belonging to this poor species, this very plastic species, whose plastic genome has been taken advantage of by people and turned into all these cultivated crops, all these cultivated varieties. So back on the subject of leaves, let's leave poor Brassica oleracea alone. And let's take a look at the lettuce. Lactuca. Lacto, meaning milk, milky. Sativa, satisfying, edible, a crop, sativa. Lettuce is actually in the sunflower family. You can see here the flowers of lettuce look something like a dandelion or a hawksweed or a marigold. You can kind of see the familial similarities there. So lettuce is in the Asteraceae family, the dandelions and so on. And Lactuca, suggesting there's something milky about this plant. And wild lettuce has a milky latex sap. And that sap is actually an allergen to some people. Some people are actually allergic to lettuce sap. It is, after all, a defensive chemical to prevent its being eaten. But people, being people, have outwitted that defensive chemical and selected mutations that have less and less and less and less until eventually none of that defensive chemical. Romaine lettuce, which is a cultivar longifolia with long leaves, still is the closest to the wild type, and romaine still does have, you might even be able to taste it, a more slightly bitter taste. And fresh from the garden romaine, if you break the leaves, you can still see a little bit of that white milky sap, that latex, oozing out. And so therefore, some people who have an intolerance to that latex can't eat romaine, but they can eat other cultivars where that sap has been selected against and removed through breeding to the point where the seedlings never produce that chemical in the first place. Iceberg lettuce, Lactuca sativa, and just like the cabbage, capitata, which means it's been turned into a head. Again, here we have a thing that couldn't survive in the wild. Obviously, wouldn't have a chance. Again, this is a mutation where everything, all the leaves are folded in on themselves over and over and over again. Zero, how do I make a zero? Zero benefit to the plant. Lots of benefit to people, because look, in the folding over of all these leaves, all that tissue inside isn't exposed to the sun. And therefore, it is, the word is etiolated. It's blanched. It has never seen the sun. It has never developed chlorophyllous tissues. It's just kept in the dark, literally, and kept very, very tender and weak. Weak might be the word that I've been struggling to find. So all this weak and therefore very tender tissues towards the inside of this iceberg lettuce. So that's Lactuca leaves, the lettuce leaves, and how we've changed and modified them. And I don't need to go on about all the different cultivars and varieties of lettuce. We have different colors and shapes and so on. Our next leaf that we'll look at belongs to celery. And here we have celery plants. And these are one of those plants that produce a ring of leaves right at the ground level with a taproot. And then when the conditions are right, the stem begins to elongate. And this is another one where we stop that process from happening and we chop all the leaves off right at the base of the ground. And what's left for us to eat are these leaf bases. So each one of these leaves, the stalk of the individual leaf is swollen, exaggerated, and is storing up lots of carbohydrate and fiber, much beyond the wild plant's capability or ability. This is definitely a plant that has been cultivated very, very unnaturally to have these exaggerated tissues, the leaf petioles. The stem itself will eventually develop, and before it elongates, can and does store up some starch before the main flowering stem bursts free. And we have this critter known as celeriac. And if you haven't tried celeriac, it is the stored up starches of celery, certain selections that have an exaggerated amount of that stored up starch, but it has a very lovely taste, very mild celery taste. but it is the leaves themselves on the celery that we're eating. Some people think they're stems because they're, juicy. But no, the stem is this part here where the leaves are attached, and each one of these represents an individual leaf. When celery does break free of the confines and elongate and initiate flowering, just like the carrots and the parsnips that it's related to, it produces these flat-topped inflorescences with these tiny little white flowers presenting all their reproductive bits to the pollinators, the bees and the wasps and what have you. And after the flowers are fertilized, the seeds begin to develop to generate the plant into the next year. And with celery, if that process is allowed to go through fruition, we people can then harvest the seeds and use the seeds for our own benefit or pleasure or both. And celery seed is one of a myriad of spices that people have derived and taken advantage of. And spices very often represent plant defensive chemicals. Celery does not want its seeds to be eaten. And a chewed up seed is a seed that will never germinate and grow. So a seed that is full of poison is going to prevent its being eaten. But people being big can take that poison and crush it up and grind it up and add it to our food as flavoring. So spices, an offshoot of today's presentation, we'll look at next week, and how humans have taken natural plant defensive chemistry and created the spices that we're familiar with today. So no further on that. We'll crash on. But on the subject of seeds, before we move beyond that part, did want to mention grains. Grains refer to the seeds of grasses. And remember when I just said seeds don't want to be eaten? An eaten seed is a seed that doesn't ever germinate. Many grains have defensive chemicals that keep them from being eaten. Humans have exaggerated a lot of starch into certain grass seeds and created cultivars that are very, very important, if not essential, to the lives of many people in the world. We'll talk about how a kernel of corn is a fruit when we get to the fruit part. Back to leaves. All right, everybody knows this leaf, Popeye's leaf. It's the spinach, Spinachia oleracea. This is another plant who the wild form of Spinachia oleracea has been eaten by people for millennia, but the defensive chemicals that the plant produces to prevent being eaten have been bred out. Not entirely successfully in spinach. And those of you who eat raw spinach and notice that your teeth get kind of squeaky, that is because of the presence of the oxalic acid crystals that are concentrated in spinach leaves to prevent them from being eaten. We're supposed to hate it. We're supposed to hate it. I don't hate it. Anyway. Defensive mechanisms, spinach. And on the subject of defensive leaves, offensive leaves, if you will, the onion leaf bases grow concentric to one another around the developing stem, which is kept as that short little bunched up layer of tissue until it's time to elongate and initiate flowering. But in the meantime, the leaf bases overlap one another and fill up with starches to feed the developing flower that the following year or at the end of the season is going to push up through the heart of all this and emerge through the top and flower and produce the seeds. But in the meantime, the defensive chemicals build up in those leaf tissues. And this thing, synpropanthenyl S oxide, that is a chemical that this plant produces, which upon exposure to oxygen, that is by cutting or biting into this leaf tissue, once you cut or bite into this leaf tissue, this thing, whatever it is, combines with oxygen to form a noxious chemical that is supposed to scare you away and get you to stop and get you to go no further in the destruction of these leaf tissues. Doesn't work on us, obviously. We love our onions and we love cooking them, and some people actually, love to eat the raw onion. They like the effect that they get from this defensive poison being thrown at their eyes, trying to get them to stop. Onions, there are hundreds of species of wild onion. We're not sure which one or ones were brought into cultivation and selected for the bigger and bigger and bigger storage leaves. But we do know that onions have been with people and trying for 7,000 years to keep people from eating them, but it hasn't worked at all. And onions have been in cultivation for more than 7,000 years. Now, I hope everyone's okay. I've been crashing on for just about an hour. We still have one more subject to go. I wouldn't forgive you if you needed to go right at 3. Right now, we're going to take just a quick 5-minute bio break. Please, if you have any questions, do put those in the Q&A. If you have to leave us, we appreciate you staying with us this far. But coming up next, after a quick break, we'll dive into the subject, the very mysterious subject of fruit. All right, and thanks to all who have the ability and the bandwidth to stick with us. We're going to go ahead and carry on. We've gone through the roots, the stems, and the leaves. Now we're going to focus on that magic organ of flowering plants that is known as the fruit. We're all supposed to eat fruit every day. We all know this. Fruit has a nutritional definition. Fruit has a U.S. Department of Agriculture definition. But for us today, us botanists, we need to extend that definition and into its botanical origin, where fruit is defined as the ripened ovary of a flowering plant that contains seeds. No matter what, sweet, poisonous, edible, dry, covered in spines, if it's a ripened ovary full of seeds, it is a fruit, botanically speaking, okay? Fruit also most often make some provision for the dispersal of that seed somewhere away from the parent plant. So getting the seed ripe and safe and somehow sent out into the world. That is the definition and the function of the fruit. Fruit is the ripened ovary of flowering plants. Plants that belong to that part of the plant kingdom that produce flowers. Now, you might be surprised at what's a flowering plant and what isn't, but that's for another time. Let's just take a look at some of the flowering plants that do produce fruit from their ripened ovaries, one of which would be the tomato. We have this flowering plant known as tomato solanum, again, solanum. We have a cross section, a longitudinal section of the flower here, and we have all the flower parts labeled for our scientific study, but this is the one to focus on, the ovary. Inside the ovary are the egg cells, and the egg cells become the seeds, and the ovary becomes the fruit. So once pollination has occurred, the ovary tissue here begins to grow and nourish the ovules, which upon fertilization become seeds, which are going to be the next generation. That's botany. That's the botanical definition of fruit, this ripened ovary containing seeds. Within the family, a family that we have met before, the Solanaceae, the result of the pollination of the flowers of these plants lead to these fruits: tomato, peppers, aubergine, chilies, and this is tomatillo. So these are all ripened ovaries containing fruit. These are all the result of a flower, and on some you can even still see parts of the flower here, the sepals, the papery sepals of the tomatilla, the sepals of the aubergine here, the flower containing the ovary containing the ovules which become the seed and the fruit. In this one family, all these variety of fruit types. The rose family contains rose hips, which are often made into jam. The stone fruits are in the rose family. Apples, so all of these fleshy bits are ripened ovary. Strawberry's a weirdo. The seeds are not on the outside of the strawberry fruit. The seeds are inside each one of these little yellow dots, each one of those yellow dots being a separate fruit. But that's another That's for another class. The cucumber or the melon family, these ripened ovaries give us cucumbers and zucchini and the melons and the squashes and the gourds. So fruit has a biological, a botanical definition apart from our USDA definition. And when we're looking at fruit, we're looking at ripened ovaries. And here we have, again, each one of those little dots on the outside of a strawberry is a separate fruit, is a separate ovary with a seed inside of that little yellow dot. The swollen part is actually stem tissue. Legumes are fruits with seeds inside. An acorn is a fruit with a seed inside. Each one of these little dandelion fluffs is a flying ovary that's taking its seed, its cargo of one seed across and far away from the parent plant. And an ear of corn, each kernel represents a single ripened ovary with a massive seed inside. So fruit has this botanical definition. It's the result of a pollinated flower and a ripened ovary. We'll go much deeper into that and everything else plant related at our advanced plant identification class, which starts next month. Drop us a question in Q&A if you'd like the link to that. We can also link to that in the chat if that's a class that you're particularly interested in pursuing. But for now, we'll finish up with a weird fruit. You know, you're telling me that fruits are ripened ovary with seeds inside. Well, where are all the seeds in a banana, huh? Well, banana is a hybrid between two different species. And sometimes when two separate species that would never normally reproduce with one another are artificially brought together and a hybrid results from that union, that hybrid could be sterile. That means unable to reproduce. That means perhaps unable to produce flowers. That's one way to be sterile, which could mean unable to produce pollen, but could still ripen an ovary. In the case of this cross between two species of wild bananas, a single seedling resulted that produced flowers and fruit that contained no seeds, just little flakes, little suggestions of what may have ever become a seed, but completely sterile with a full-sized fruit. That cross between the Musa acuminata, and here's what wild banana fruit, the Musa acuminata fruit, full of these hard black seeds, floating in actually a nice, sweet, custardy dispersal mechanism. This is one that's meant to be eaten, and the seeds pass through a digestive system and plant Musa acuminata somewhere far away from the parent. Same with Musa balbisiana. But when the two of these were crossed, a single seedling popped up that produced these uniformly sized, uniformly flavored, thick-skinned, sterile fruit. All the hallmarks of a desirable commercial crop. And that is the crop that we today know as the banana. And it's what we expect. That one seedling was cloned billions of times. And each clone was planted in a row, in rows upon rows upon rows upon rows, in many tropical countries. That single clone, that one plant, cloned billions of times and planted in all these rows. so that when it went through this false life cycle and produced these flowers that never got pollinated, and then produced these fruits that contained no seeds, they could be harvested. And that plant had a name, Gros Michel. That one plant that we cloned all those billions of times, it got sick. And it had no defenses against the disease that it caught. And so that one plant, a billion times over, got sicker and sicker and sicker as that disease spread. And eventually, this cultivar was unable to be produced on a commercial scale. Thankfully, there were breeding programs, remember we talked about those earlier, where cultivars were being fiddled with and made and tested and trialed. And another cultivar called the Cavendish, named Cavendish, a cultivar, was discovered that had all those characteristics. A thick skin that wouldn't bruise during shipping, a sweet fruit that was consistently sized and had a banana-y flavor. And so after the 50s, after the decline of Gros Michel, we had the Cavendish replace it. And now every single banana that you buy is a Cavendish. Well, now Cavendish has got the gunk. And all these billions of individual plants, clones of the Cavendish, are getting sick with the same disease, the Panama disease. It's a fusarium disease. And so hopefully there's another cultivar in the background that's resistant. Barring any resistance to this disease, the fungicides and the bactericides are going to have to continually be poured on these plants to try and halt the spread of the disease. Because people, when they go to the grocery store, what they expect to find is a yellow banana that's this color, this size, this shape, this length, this price. That's what people want from bananas. They're not going to go and, I don't want an orange banana or a red banana. That's not what a banana, I don't want a short banana. I don't know what that is. So we've become so accustomed to bananas having these characteristics at this price that hopefully another cultivar can be developed that can take the place of the Cavendish now that it's basically its time is up. So what do? Let's maybe push the boat out a little bit. Let's try that orange banana. Maybe the skin is too thin for it to ship across the sea. Maybe these will have to be grown closer to home where they don't have to be sent from another continent. Maybe these are some crops that can be grown right here in Florida. Maybe we're going to have to learn to live without bananas altogether. Maybe the new cultivar isn't going to have a thick enough skin that's going to keep it pristine on its transport to the United States, or maybe it's going to have to be wrapped in such a way that's going to make it price prohibitive to purchase and too expensive. So it might be worth trying out fruits that are grown more closer to home. Things that are not as well known are sometimes referred to as exotic. And until something becomes well known, it's exotic. So push the boat out, give it a shot, try some exotic fruit. You might find something that you like, something that's just as suited to your lunchbox as the banana. So that's probably enough. Look at how much you already know about plants just by having held them in your hands your entire life. You've been eating stems, roots, leaves. You've been eating cultivars and mutants of plants that look nothing like their wild counterpart that all of these things have been derived from. There's still an awful lot more to learn. And we hope that you'll stay with us in the coming months and years, hopefully, as we bring you more on how much more there is to learn about the wonderful plant kingdom, not just what's found right here wild in Pinellas County, but how we can use our familiarity with some of these plants through our own exposure in the kitchen and on the dinner plate. You already happen to know quite a lot, and we hope that you desire to build on that going forward. But for now, Julia's going to launch a poll. We'd love to get your opinion on a couple of things. That'll be up for just a few seconds until the majority of y'all have weighed in with some answers to a few questions here. Meanwhile, feel free to put some questions in the Q&A. We have a question from Joan. Are the seeds inside a pomegranate supposed to be eaten or just the surrounding red stuff? That's a taste thing. I know people that chew up the seeds and swallow them. And I know people that clean them off and spit the seeds out. It's up to you. I think it would be hard to harm yourself by eating too many pomegranate seeds. I wouldn't worry about that too much. So it's purely an issue of taste. I think I'm a spitter-outer, which is probably why I don't eat too many pomegranates. I do know that pomegranate has become quite a popular juice. People are quite into pomegranate juice. How do nuts fit in? That's a great question, anonymous attendee. A nut is a type of fruit. A nut is a type of fruit that has a hard seed coat with the cotyledons inside. Walnut is probably the classic nut. And an acorn is considered a nut. Botanically speaking, a nut is a type of fruit. Has anyone, okay, this is an interesting question. Has anyone that I know of ever tried to take that defensive chemical out of the onion, and what has happened to the flavor? There are onion cultivars that are milder. So yes, there have been breeding strategies to lessen the amount of that chemical that's present. I don't think it's ever successfully been completely eliminated. There is a garlic that has very little of that compound. It's called elephant garlic. It's actually derived from it's very close to the species. It has not nearly as much of that compound. Please tell me where okra fits in. Okra is a fruit. Okra is the ripened ovary of a plant that is very close to a hibiscus. It's related to hibiscus. It's in that family, the Malvaceae family. If you saw an okra flower, you would say that's a hibiscus because it's so closely related. But once the flower is pollinated and the ovary begins to grow, it elongates into that okra. Once the fruit is ripe and the seeds are ready to be dispersed, the okra fruit dries and splits along 5 seams, and the dry seeds actually shake out like a shaker. And if you've ever seen a dry okra pod, some fruits are dry when they're ripe, like the okra pod, and the ripened seeds shake out. Tomatoes, we have a question about what about tomatoes? Tomatoes, I think I did remove from this presentation the kind of progression from the tomato flower with the ovary right at the center of the flower and the pollen bearing structures. And once pollen is transferred from another plant, all the petals fall away, all the tomato flower petals fall away, and all that's left on the stalk is that ovary, and it begins to grow and swell and turn red. And what you have is the fruit of the tomato plant with the ripe seeds inside? So great questions today. Thank you very much for your questions. And do pay attention. We have some upcoming classes over the next couple of weeks. Next week, as I mentioned before, will be Spice Science right here at 2 o'clock. And following that, we're going to get back to some serious botanical science for beginners. And we're going to let you stick your foot in ahead of an introduction to plant identification, a subject that many people have shown an interest in learning more about. And we're here for you on that. There are all kinds of reasons to study and to continue to study and practice plant identification, all leading up to kind of our flagship class, which this year will be held in April, next month, over 3 consecutive Saturdays, each class being 4 hours long. There's a fee for this course. All the textbook and course materials are included in that. We'll send you more information for that. If you're interested, do let us know. Otherwise, visit our website, brookercreekpreserve.org, for more information on that. And to finish, thank you very much for sticking with us. Really appreciate you spending your afternoon with us. As always, for those that are new to the presentations, we hope you'll join us again sometime. For those that have been tuning in regularly for these past couple months, year, thank you also for that. And do drop me a line if you have any questions,